The snow had a way of hiding roofs that I never got used to, not even after 6 winters of it. You'd walk right over a dead man's house and never know, the drifts smoothing everything the same flat white, and the land lying to you with every step. We were 3 days into weather that should have taken us 5 to cross, the storm pushing us hard down out of the Sapphire side and onto the old freight road that ran south toward the valley floor. My brother walked ahead of me that morning, breaking trail with his shoulders hunched against wind that had teeth in it, and I watched his boot heels for the 100th time that week, thinking about how a man's whole world could shrink down to just that, the heels of his brother's boots, and the next quarter-mile. It was a little past noon, best as I could figure without a sun to check it by, when he stopped so sudden I near walked into him. "There," he said, and pointed with his chin, not his hand, the way he did when the cold had worked too deep into his fingers to spare the effort. I didn't see it at first, just more snow, more of that same rolling white that had been swallowing the road all morning, but he had an eye for wrongness that I'd learned to trust since he was small, and when I looked again I saw it too, a long rectangular dip running maybe 20 feet, too straight to be a fold in the land, too even to be drift and wind alone, like something underneath was holding its shape against the snow instead of giving in to it. "Could be a wagon," I said. "Could be nothing." "Could be," he said, and was already unslinging his pack. We dug with what we had, the hand axe, our tin cups turned over and used like scoops, our bare-gloved hands when the crust got too packed for tools. 20 minutes in, sweat going cold under my collar despite the wind, my axe struck something that didn't give the soft answer of frozen ground. It gave back a hollow wooden sound, and Silas and I looked at each other the way you do when the day has just changed shape on you. We cleared another foot of snow, and there it was. A roofline, collapsed at one corner, the timber beam beneath it dark with age and split along the grain. I brushed at it with my glove until the frost gave up its hold, and the letters came clear a stroke at a time, stamped deep into the wood by some long-gone hand. Bitterroot Freight and Storage Co. Neither of us said anything for a while. The wind kept working at the drift beside us, filling back in what we'd just dug out, patient as anything that has all the time in the world and no reason to hurry. "Freight and storage," Silas said finally, like the words themselves were strange to him. "Out here, 20 miles from anything." "20 miles from anything is right," I said, and stood up to work the ache out of my back before it set in for good. We'd come down off the divide 6 days before, following the old freight road south, the way a man follows a fence line he can't see the ends of, trusting it goes somewhere because somebody built it for a reason once. Our aim had been Alder Gulch No. 2 itself, or what was left of it. A played-out camp we'd heard was down to a handful of stubborn souls, but a roof was a roof, and January in the Bitterroot doesn't forgive a man for being particular about company. We'd left the Clark Fork with 11 days of hardtack and bacon between us, cut down now to maybe 3, and a little under $40 split between my coat lining and Silas's boot, which was the whole of what we had in the world besides what sat on our backs. 40 pounds apiece, near enough. The sharp slung across my shoulder since it was my turn to carry it, the hand axe, the tin cup Silas favored over any cook pot we'd never bothered to buy, 2 bedrolls gone thin as bread at the elbows. The morning had started clear enough, cold in that flat blue way that tells you the wind hasn't decided what it wants to do yet, and by noon it had decided, coming hard down off the peaks to the west, the kind of wind that finds every gap in a coat like it's been sent looking. We'd made maybe 9 miles when Silas pointed out the shape of the drift ahead, sitting wrong against the tree line, too square-shouldered to be a snowbank the mountain had built on its own. I'd wanted to keep walking, told him whatever it was could keep till spring, and Alder Gulch couldn't be more than half a day off yet, if the road held. He'd looked at me the way he does when he's already decided something and is only waiting on me to catch up to it. "Half a day in this wind is a long half day, Nate," he'd said, and he wasn't wrong, and the light was already thinking about leaving us for the day. That gray early dusk the mountains get in January, like the sun's got somewhere better to be. So we'd turned off the road, packs creaking, and made for the mound, telling ourselves it was shelter we were after, and nothing more. A windbreak, maybe an old-line shack with enough roof left to keep the worst of it off us through the night. That was all. That was the whole of our reasoning, stood there with the wind cutting past my ears, and Silas already unslinging the axe from his belt. Neither one of us with the first idea that we were about to start digging into something that wasn't going to let either of us walk away from it clean. The mound had a shape to it once you stood close enough to read it, too square for a drift, too regular for anything the wind had made on its own. Silas found the first give in the snow with his boot heel, a soft spot where the crust broke through to nothing, and he looked back at me with that grin he gets when he's found something before I have, which is most of the time, if I'm honest about it. We dug with the axe and our hands both, taking turns, the snow packed hard as plaster in the top foot, and looser underneath, where it had drifted in over years rather than fallen fresh. It took the better part of an hour to open a hole wide enough for a man's shoulders, and by then the light had gone the color of a bruise, and I was thinking less about shelter and more about just being somewhere the wind wasn't reaching us direct. The roof gave under Silas, before it gave under me. One boot punched clean through rotted shingle and old snow load, and he went down to his waist with a shout that was more surprise than fear, and then the rest of him followed, and I heard him land somewhere below with a thud and a curse, and then, after a breath too long for my liking, a laugh. Nate, you'd better come see this." I dropped in after him, feet first, into a dark that smelled of cold sawdust and something mineral underneath it, like a cellar that had never once seen a summer. It took my eyes a slow minute to make sense of the shapes around us, and when they did, I stood there with my hand still on the axe handle and didn't say anything at all for a spell. We'd come down expecting ice, blocks of it, cut from some creek or the river itself, stacked and packed in straw the way every ice house in every mining town keeps its summer cool. What we found instead were crates, wooden ones, sealed tight with nailed lids, packed not in straw but in sawdust, dry as flour, and stacked in 3 long rows that ran the length of the room and back into a dark I couldn't yet see the end of. 40 of them, maybe more. Set close, level, deliberate. Not thrown in and forgotten but placed, the way a man places things he means to come back for. Silas was already crouched by the nearest one, running his glove along a stenciled mark on the side, and when he looked up at me his grin had gone thin at the edges, the way it does when curiosity starts to feel like something else. "Bitterroot freight and storage," he read out. "Nate, company's been gone since before I could walk." I looked down the row of crates disappearing into the dark, and felt the cold in that room reach a little deeper into me than the wind outside ever had. "A company gone before you could walk, built something that still stands," I said, mostly to myself, and set my pack down against the wall. My hands had gone stiff enough that pulling the hand axe free took longer than it should have. Silas held the lantern close while I worked the blade under the lid of that first crate, and the nails came up slow, groaning like they hadn't been asked to move in years, which they hadn't. The lid came free, and sawdust spilled out over my boots, fine and dry as I'd guessed, and underneath it, packed in rows of their own, sat bottles. Small ones, glass gone cloudy with age, corked and sealed with wax that had cracked but held. I lifted one out and turned it to what light we had, and Silas leaned in so close his breath fogged the glass before I could read it clean. Stamped right into the bottle itself, not a paper label but pressed into the glass the way a man does when he wants something to last. Dr. Josiah Kellerman, Alder Gulch No. 2, M.T., and below that, smaller, a date. 1883. 6 years, Silas said. 6 years old, and somebody built a room in the mountain to keep it cold. I didn't answer him right off. I was thinking about Alder Gulch No. 2, the way we'd passed within sight of it 3 days back. What was left of it, anyway. A scatter of gray buildings and a head frame leaning like a man, asleep on his feet. Nobody moving in the streets we could see from the ridge. I hadn't thought much of it then. A played-out camp was nothing new in that country. But a played-out camp doesn't explain 40 crates of medicine sealed up in sawdust and hidden under a collapsed roof 20 miles north of where it was made. I set the bottle back down careful, like it might still matter to somebody, and pulled the axe again to open the crate beside it. Same sawdust, same bottles, same stamp, same name, same year, over and over, crate after crate, like the room had been built around a single fact repeating itself. Medicine don't usually get buried, I said. It gets used. Silas had gone quiet in the way he does when something's turning over in him slower than his mouth wants it to. He ran his glove along the stenciled company name again, then let his hand drop to the floorboards under the nearest row, and I watched his brow pull tight. Nate, he said, floor's loose here. I came around the crate to look, lantern light swinging long shadows down that row of 40 sealed boxes, and past them into the dark, where I still couldn't see the back wall of the room, if there was one at all. I got down on a knee where he pointed, and it was true. The plank wasn't nailed the way the rest were. The rest of that floor was laid tight, board against board, the kind of joinery a man does when he means a thing to last. But this one plank, maybe 3 feet long, sat loose in its notch, like it had been lifted and set back more than once. Before I worked at it, I stood back up and looked at the room, the way Silas must have been looking at it. He was right about the crates. I'd been so taken with what was inside them I hadn't marked how they sat. 40-some boxes, and they weren't stacked the way a freight company stacks goods, not shoulder to shoulder, packed tight to save the room. They stood in 3 long rows with a clear aisle between each, wide enough for a man to walk through carrying something, and every crate faced the same direction, lids toward the door. Storage don't need an aisle. Storage gets crammed in wherever it fits. That's not how you store ice, Silas said, and it wasn't a question. I didn't answer him. I went back down to the plank and got my fingers under the edge and pried, and it came up easier than the cold should have allowed, like it had been lifted enough times that the wood had given up gripping. Under it was packed earth, hard as stone, and set into a shallow scrape in that earth was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tied twice with waxed cord gone stiff and dark. I lifted it out with both hands. It weighed nothing, hardly more than the cloth itself, but it had the particular heaviness that comes from a thing being kept on purpose, hidden on purpose, and I felt that before I'd even got the cord untied. Silas crouched beside me with the lantern held low so the light wouldn't gutter, and I worked the knots with fingers gone half numb, and the oilcloth peeled back stiff at the folds, cracking a little at the creases the way old leather does in deep cold. Inside was a ledger, bound plain, no title stamped on the cover, the kind of book a store clerk or a claimsman might use for tallying debts. The pages were foxed at the edges and smelled of tallow and something else underneath it I couldn't yet name. I opened it flat on my knee. The first page was a column of names, written in a careful hand that had pressed hard enough to leave the ink standing up off the paper in places. Beside each name, a figure in dollars. Beside some of the figures, a small check mark. Beside others, nothing at all. Names of what? Silas said, low, like he already half knew he didn't want the answer yet. I turned the lantern closer and started reading down the column, and the room around us, 40 crates deep in sawdust and silence, didn't feel like a storehouse anymore. I read them out loud, low, because it felt wrong to read them silent, the way it feels wrong to whisper past a man sleeping. Corliss, Ephraim, $8, checkmark. Danvers, twins, no first names given, just the Danvers twins. $10, no checkmark. My voice caught on that one, and I had to start the line over. $10 for what, though? Silas said. Storage, freight. It's a freight company's book. But it wasn't. I turned the page and found the heading written across the top in the same hard hand, the ink pressed so deep it had nearly cut through to the other side. Winter Keeping, Bitterroot Freight and Storage Co., payment received for preservation of remains pending ground thaw. Below that, the dates started, December of 1883, then January, then February, March, running clear into May before the column of names finally stopped. I sat with that a long moment. Silas didn't say anything either. The lantern hissed where a draft found it. They weren't storing ice here, I said, or not only ice. They were storing people. I nodded, though he couldn't have seen it clear in that light, and went back to the page. The amounts ran from $8 up to $15, and I understood, slow the way understanding comes when you don't want it, that the money wasn't for a coffin or a stone or a preacher's time. It was rent on cold, so a body could wait out a winter too hard for digging, until the ground gave enough in spring to take it proper. Every name paid for was a family that couldn't bury their own dead when the dying happened, because the ground was iron and the town, whatever else it was, still had church rules about consecrated soil and thaw. May of '84, I said. That's near 6 months of names. That's not one bad fever, Silas said. That's a town's worth. I turned back a page, then forward again, counting without meaning to, the way you count fence posts on a long road, just to have something for your mind to do. 30-some names by my rough tally, maybe more, packed close in that careful hand, and beside most of them a check mark like a small closed door. Paid, kept, come spring taken out and buried and done. But not beside all of them. I could see that much even in the lantern's poor light, spots on the page where the check mark should have sat and didn't, where the line just ended bare, and I did not yet know what that bareness meant, only that it sat wrong in my chest, same as an unfinished sentence, and I found I did not want to turn to the last page and count how many. Silas took the ledger from my hands before I could stop him, which was like him, always the one to reach past a thing I was still working up to. He held it close to the lantern and started at the front page, running his finger down the names slow, mouthing some of them the way a man does when he's making sure of his own count. Abernathy, he said. Checked. Boyle, checked. Both the Boyle children, checked. He went on like that a while, and I let him, because it seemed like work that wanted doing careful rather than fast. Outside the wind had picked up again, working at the collapsed roofline above us, and every so often a fall of snow came down through the gap and hissed against the crates. He got to the last page before I did, since I'd stopped counting somewhere in the 20s out of a feeling I couldn't name, and he went quiet in a way that made me look up. 27 checked, he said. I make 31 names total. He turned the ledger so I could see, and there they were, plain as anything. 4 lines near the bottom with no mark beside them at all. Pruitt, and under that, 3 more Pruitts, a woman's name and what looked like children's, ages noted small in the margin, the way the doctor or whoever kept this book noted such things. 6 years old, 4 years old, an infant, no age given, just the word. That's not a mistake, Silas said. A man doesn't forget to check 4 names out of 31 and get all the rest right. No, I said. He doesn't. We looked at each other over the lantern, and I think we both understood the shape of it before either of us said so, the way you understand a story's ending, sometimes before the man telling it gets there. 27 families had paid their $8 or $10 or $15, and come spring the ground had softened enough, and the dead had gone into consecrated soil same as anybody's dead ought to. But 4 had stayed. 4 names with the door never closed. I stood up, knees stiff from crouching, and took the lantern from Silas's hand. The light didn't carry far in that room, the crates rising up dark on either side of us in their 3 long rows. But I could see now that the last row ran back further than I'd first thought, back into a part of the ice house we hadn't yet touched, where the sawdust drifts sat undisturbed, and the air went colder still, colder than a Montana January had any right making a man feel indoors. Back there, I said, and Silas didn't ask what I meant. He picked up the axe. We went back there together, the lantern between us, throwing our shadows long across the sawdust, and I counted the paces the way a man counts anything when he doesn't want to think too hard about what he's walking toward. 9 steps. 10. The last row of crates sat apart from the others, not stacked 3 high like the rest, but set on the floor single file. 4 of them, spaced with a gap between each one, like whoever had carried them back here hadn't wanted them touching. Silas held the lantern steady while I worked the axe head under the lid of the nearest crate. The wood had frozen tight to itself over 5 winters, and it took some coaxing, some working the blade in a half-inch at a time along the seam, before the nails gave with a sound like a knuckle cracking. I lifted the lid and set it aside. Sawdust first, packed the same as all the others. I brushed it back with my glove, slow, and my hand stopped on something that wasn't sawdust at all, but cloth, a wool dress gone stiff as bark, and under that the shape of a woman, small, curled some on her side like she'd been laid down sleeping rather than dead. The cold had kept her the way cold keeps meat in a smokehouse, dark and shrunk and strange to look at, but there was no mistaking what she was. I didn't say anything. Silas didn't either. He set the lantern on the crate's edge and crouched down at the next one over, and I heard him working his own blade along the seam while I still knelt there with my hand resting on the first lid, not moving. The second crate held a boy, no older than 8 or 9 by the size of him. The third was smaller still, maybe 5. The fourth I almost couldn't bring myself to open, and when I did, the last one, the smallest, wasn't much bigger than a bread loaf, wrapped close in what might have been a christening gown once, white gone the color of old ivory. A family, Silas said. His voice came out low, like the ice house itself was a church, and he didn't want to raise it. All of them together. I thought of the ledger, of the 4 names Silas had read off with the check marks missing beside them, and I didn't need to go back and look to know how they'd read. A mother's name first, then 3 more beneath it, close in the alphabet the way kin get written down together by a clerk who knew the family and didn't need telling. Somebody paid to have them kept, I said. Somebody meant to come back for them. Then why didn't they? I looked at the 4 crates in their careful spacing, and at the sawdust drifted deep around them like snow that had found its way indoors and never left, and I didn't have an answer for him yet. But I had a feeling starting in me, the kind that comes before you've reasoned a thing out, that whoever had meant to come back for this family hadn't been able to, and that the reason why was going to matter more than anything else we'd find in that ice house. We backed out of the ice house into the gray afternoon and stood a while letting our eyes adjust to the ordinary light, and Silas said what I knew he'd been turning over since the crates opened. Pass'll close within the week. You know that as well as I do. I did know it. I'd felt the change in the air 2 days back, that particular stillness before a big snow, the kind our father used to say you could taste if you knew what to taste for. We had maybe 7, 8 days of clear travel left before the country shut its door on us till March. And we've got $40 between us and no work waiting anywhere, he went on. We go south to Corvallis chasing 4 names in a ledger. That's 5 days gone before we've even started digging. Ground's frozen solid. Take another 2, 3 days after that just to break it. I know the arithmetic same as you. Then you know it don't favor us. I looked back at the doorway we'd cleared, black against the snow, and thought about the mother and 3 children stacked in their careful row at the back, waiting through 6 winters for somebody who never came. Somebody had paid $8, $10, $12 apiece to keep them frozen decent until spring thaw, and then spring had come and gone 27 times for the 27 that got claimed, and never once for these 4. Not because nobody cared, because whatever had happened to whoever meant to come back, it had happened hard enough that 4 names just never got crossed off. We leave them, I said, and that ledger goes back under the floor, same as we found it, and in another 6 years, somebody else clears this roof, or it caves in first, and either way, those 4 stay exactly where a proud town left them, forgotten twice. That's not on us, Nate. No, I said, it ain't, but we're the ones standing here knowing it. He didn't answer that right off. He was 19, and practical, the way our mother had been practical, weighing a thing by what it cost against what it fed, and I couldn't fault the sense in him. But I'd made my mind up somewhere between the crates and the doorway, quiet as that, the way I generally did. We lose the pass, we winter in Corvallis, I said. Worse places to sit out a snow than a town with a church and a store. He looked at the ice house a long moment, then at me, and something in his face gave the way it did when he'd stopped arguing and started planning instead. Then we'd best get that ledger back out, he said, and start figuring which 27 are already accounted for. We packed the ledger back under the plank, weighted the crates as we'd found them, and pulled the door shut on the 27 names already accounted for, walking away from that ice house the way you'd walk away from a room where someone's sleeping. 22 miles south to Corvallis took us the better part of a day and a half. The freight road half drifted over, the sharps riding heavy across my back the whole way. We came into town on a Thursday afternoon, the 17th of January, smoke standing straight up out of a dozen chimneys in air, so still it felt like the valley was holding its breath along with us. Corvallis wasn't much. A store, a church with a bell nobody rang before 9, a scattering of houses along one street stamped hard with wagon ruts frozen into ridges. The trading post keeper was a man named Elias Frost, gray at the temples, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from some winter he never explained, and he'd been keeping that store since before either of us was born, near as I could tell. He listened to the whole of it without once interrupting, arms folded on the counter, and when Silas got to the part about the 4 crates in back, Frost went quiet in a way that told me he already half knew. Pruitt's kept a claim up the gulch, he said finally. Husband died of the same fever, spring of '84, before the ground softened enough to bury him proper either. Buried him here in Corvallis that April. Then the mine played out that summer. Bitterroot Consolidated pulled its money, pulled its men, and Alder Gulch just about emptied inside a year. Whoever was supposed to go back for that family, there wasn't anybody left to send. Company that owned the ice house folded same season. Nobody stole those crates. Nobody forgot on purpose. There just wasn't a soul left standing who remembered they were owed for. He said it plain, the way a man states a fact about weather, but I watched something move behind his eyes all the same. He asked did we know kin, sisters, brothers, any Pruitts scattered down river, and we told him we didn't, only the names off the ledger and a paid amount beside each. I'll ask around when the circuit rider comes through, he said. Meantime, you'll want the sled. He had a mule and a flat sled out back he used hauling flour up from the mill, and he loaned it to us without asking collateral. Just a look that said he expected it back in one piece, and expected us to finish what we'd started. We slept that night in his storeroom among flour sacks and coal oil, warm for the first time in 3 days, and I lay listening to Silas, breathing steady beside me, thinking about a husband already buried while his wife and children waited frozen 20 miles north for a town that no longer had hands enough to carry them down. We started back north before first light, the mule taking the sled easy over crust snow that had frozen hard enough overnight to hold weight without breaking through. It took us the better part of a day to reach the ice house again, and another to load the 4 crates onto the sled and lash them tight with rope we'd bought at the store for 30 cents. Going down was slower than coming up. The mule didn't like the smell, even sealed in wood and sawdust, and kept its ears back the whole 22 miles, and we didn't blame it. We got back to Corvallis on a Thursday evening, snow starting again in that fine, dry way that means it means business, and the storekeep had already spread word. There was a minister there, a thin gray man named Reverend Albert Dunmore who'd served the valley 11 years and remembered Alder Gulch No. 2 when it still had 600 souls in it, and 3 old-timers who'd known the Pruitts by name, a freight hand, a woman who'd nursed alongside the doctor, and a man who said he'd shod the husband's horse the summer before the fever came. The ground in the churchyard was frozen a foot down and stubborn below that, and it took us 6 days to open 4 graves proper, working in shifts with the hand axe and a pick the Reverend kept in his shed, breaking through where the frost held hardest and shoveling where it gave. Silas worked steadier than I'd seen him work at anything, not saying much, and I understood it without him telling me. This was the kind of labor that felt like it meant something, unlike most of what the trail asks of a man. We buried the mother first, then the 3 children beside her, smallest last, the Reverend saying words over each that weren't long but were plain and true, about a town that had failed its own, and 2 strangers who hadn't. The old-timers stood through all of it bareheaded in the cold, and the woman who'd nursed the sick cried without trying to hide it, and nobody thought less of her for it. When it was done, the ground looked raw and dark against the snow, 4 low mounds where there'd been nothing, and the Reverend said he'd see markers cut come spring, when the stone cutter in Hamilton could get up here. I asked him to write the names down proper in the church register, so there'd be no losing them twice, and he said that was already being seen to, and looked at me like he understood exactly what I meant by it. That night the Reverend asked what he owed us, and I told him nothing beyond what we'd already taken: flour, salt pork, a side of bacon, a new head for the axe I'd cracked splitting frozen ground on the 9th day. He pushed on it, said the church had a little put by, said the town of Corvallis wouldn't feel right sending us off empty-handed after 11 days of work most men wouldn't have started. I told him the work wasn't the kind you charged for. Silas didn't say anything, just nodded once, and that was the end of the argument. Before we left, I asked to see the cornerstone they were setting for the new vestry wall, and the Reverend didn't ask why. I wrapped the ledger back in its oilcloth, the same wrapping that had kept it dry 8 years in the dark of that ice house, and we set it down into the hollow of the stone before the mason mortared the cap over it. 31 names, 27 checked, 4 finally checked too, in my own hand, that morning. Seemed right it should stay there and not travel on with us. A town's debt ought to sit where the town lives, not in a drifter's pack. We left Corvallis on a Thursday, the 24th of January, with the sky already going the flat gray color that means snow is deciding when, not if. Silas walked ahead of me on the road north the way he always does, like he can't help getting somewhere first, and I found myself thinking less about the Pruitts than about the fact that we'd finished something. Most of what the mountains hand a man he never gets to finish. This one we did. I think about that ice house sometimes, still. A whole town's shame stacked in sawdust and locked behind a door, because pride is heavier than grief for some men, and it takes strangers with nothing invested in a place's good name to walk in and set it right. My brother and I didn't do it for money, and there wasn't much glory in it either. Just cold hands and 4 graves and a ledger sealed in a wall. But I've come to believe that's the only kind of debt that matters between the living and the dead. Not what's owed in dollars, but what's owed in the plain decency of finishing what somebody started and couldn't. If you've got a brother or a sister or anyone you've walked hard country with, you know there isn't much need saying between you when the work is right there in front of you both. That's the whole of it, far as I can tell. If this one stayed with you, we'd be glad to have you along for the next. Subscribe if you want more of these, and tell us in the comments about the ground you and yours have covered together.